What do you want from me? What? Please? Oh, Jesus, help me!
We are talking Night of the Scarecrow, which is a 1995 movie directed by Jeff Burr. Burr actually directed one of my favourite Gary Daniels movies, Spoiler. And this is not to be confused with the similar titled Dark Night of the Scarecrow, which was an earlier film. Now, in the pantheon of Scarecrow movies, this one, I would say, flies under the radar a little bit. There's no real big actors here. You have a couple of recognisable character actors, Dirk Blocker, Stephen Root, for example. Now, before I go any further, this review is going to have some mild spoilers. It's nearly a 30-year-old movie, but I have to discuss some plot points here that require some, explanation of what's kind of going to happen. What is the story? Well, it focuses on this small, rural American town that seems to be prospering. You know, it has a family that seems to be at the heart of all the kind of the major, institutions. We've got the four brothers, and the brothers are like the mayor, the town kind of priest, the sheriff, and the kind of the local farmer, and everyone's kind of doing well. However, there seems to be a dark curse which is about to be awoken upon this town when a couple of drunk hooligans unwittingly unleash the spirit of a long-dead warlock to inhabit the body of a scarecrow to wreak havoc on the townsfolk there. And what will happen? Well, you have to watch the movie and find out. So let us discuss what I think works in this movie. Now, I'm actually quite a big fan of Scarecrow movies, and there have been a slew of more recent ones in the last few years, none of which, to be honest with you, have really been particularly good. I really enjoy, I think it's the 1988 movie Scarecrows, which is actually one of my favourite horror movies, but there have been a couple of other ones which have been quite good, including the aforementioned Dark Night of the Scarecrow. But this one's also a pretty good movie, albeit it's somewhat forgotten. What works in this movie's favour, first of all, I have to say the cinematography, whilst rewatching it for this review, is very strong in this movie. There's a great use of lighting, the way this scarecrow is lit in kind of certain sequences. It does make it seem pretty eerie. And if I had one complaint for like the modern kind of Scarecrow movies, is that they really don't have that kind of element of creepiness that I feel is fairly inherent in the kind of a Scarecrow as a kind of a boogeyman. And it seems to be lacking in the kind of modern movies. But this one, I think, and it's partly down to the kind of the lighting, is very kind of strong. There's also some good use of photography here, different, interesting kind of camera angles, things like this that kind of give it a somewhat of a, unique feel in certain times. There's sequences, for example, where the camera is clearly attached to the actor playing the Scarecrow and kind of he's kind of walking along, so you kind of get that motion to make it look kind of quite unnatural, and it's quite effective. So I have to say, the movie is also fairly kind of good in regards to its special effects. Now, when I'm talking special effects here, I am talking practical effects, because there is a little bit of kind of early VFX which aren't so good. But the practical effects here is pretty good, and we do get quite some pretty, excruciating deaths, to be honest with you. We get a guy who gets his kind of mouth sewn up with kind of a dirty needle and kind of like, a thread and stuff. We've got a young girl who is actually only 17 when this movie was made, gets raped by a scarecrow, kind of. Not exactly, but kind of. Then she kind of sprouts out all these kind of tendrils of straw, which then drag her underground. It's pretty hardcore, to be honest with you. It's not explicitly gory, this movie, don't get me wrong, but there are a couple of decent kind of effects here, where people are dispatched in various different ways, and a lot of that is kind of like having these kind of like the straw come through their kind of bodies and things like this. So some kind of decent kind of special effects. Now we have this kind of, as I've mentioned, a slew of kind of recognisable faces in regard to some of the kind of the older kind of character actors here, and they do a pretty good job. We have these kind of four brothers, as I say, all of whom you've seen in kind of various kind of TV shows and movies and things like that. So I have to say, I think the acting, certainly for the majority of the cast at least, was pretty good. And we get some reasonable kind of mythology building here as well. We get the backstory. I mean, it's fairly obvious what's kind of going on, and I'm going to talk about that again in a minute. But we get a kind of a flashback, essentially kind of telling you the origin of this kind of like this curse and kind of, how it came to be and who's involved and everything like that, which I thought was quite a good sequence, to be honest. And it has a kind of, I mean, this is maybe it's not personally a positive for me, but I will say they try to make the character of the Scarecrow a character rather than just a kind of a faceless killing machine. He has a little bit of kind of personality to him. In actual fact, I was reading that they actually cut down, because he has a bit of dialogue, but they actually kind of cut down a lot of the dialogue sequences from him to try and make him kind of more creepy, which I have to say I think was the right choice, personally speaking. But if you're a fan of like the kind of the Freddy Krueger kind of style kind of character, and kind of like things like Scream, where you have more of a personality in your kind of killers, it veers more towards that, although maybe not quite as far. So you do have that as well, and there's a reasonably kind of high body count. And I have to say, some of these people who are kind of getting offed, I was surprised it went there. In actual fact, I've kind of detailed one of them. But that was all quite good. And I'm going to say, overall, it was an entertaining movie. It was well paced. It was well shot. I thought the actual kind of the horror elements were stronger than I was kind of anticipating for a mid kind of 90s movie. It wasn't as creepy or as genuinely kind of spooky atmosphere as I say the 1988 version of Scarecrows, but I think it was, better than most, should we say, if we have to look at Scarecrows as a kind of a subgenre in horror. It was, it had some elements, particularly in the kind of the first half of the movie, when he's less kind of like acting like Freddy Krueger, to be honest. But there are some elements here that I think are a little bit creepy. There's some good symbolism, for example, where we see like the Scarecrow being crucified for it, things like that. So, religious iconography used to kind of like, spit in the face of God, etc., etc. So there's some decent kind of shots here. Okay, so what doesn't work? The big one for me is this movie is so predictable. I mean, you guess the plot within the first 20 minutes. We have a sequence here, and I've told you there's going to be some spoilers there, where we get the kind of like this, our main protagonist is the daughter of this kind of mayor, and she kind of meets this guy, and she brings him to dinner and goes, oh, this is my father and his three brothers, all of whom are the kind of captains of industry, so to speak, and think, well, we know that in that case someone's made a deal with the devil and they've like blessed the land and all of this, and that's ultimately where it's going to come from. And the movie treats it like it's this big mystery, but it's so obvious when you kind of are kind of, when it sets it all up, really. It's like a very predictable movie, and of course then we kind of have to go through a variety of kind of red shirts ultimately to get to the kind of the characters that kind of matter. In regards to the characters, I think it would have been a stronger movie had it developed the characters of the other family members a little bit more. We get a little bit of character building from a couple of them, but not most, and therefore they do seem somewhat of a red shirt. They're kind of, they're just kind of people who are cannon fodder at the end of the day. So, and obviously our main characters, we know, are the ones that are going to have the kind of the final showdown and stuff. So it really doesn't have much in the way of surprises. Now that it's somewhat typical of kind of horror movies in regards to that came out in this kind of era, because I don't think we got more advanced storytelling, and very rarely at least, until kind of a little later on. I mean, obviously there are exceptions, things like The Exorcist and whatnot, but these kind of straight-to-video movies, these didn't really kind of have too much in the way of character building and things like that, because that's not what really people were, I think, looking for in those days. This movie does have a few kind of like logical issues and inconsistencies with its lore that it builds. So, just to give you a couple, it's established that there's this warlock basically that's kind of come back from the dead and inhabiting the Scarecrow. Fair enough. Now that's kind of established. We have extended the kind of sequence. I don't think it needed to be quite as long, but it was pretty good. And you know, we learned that ultimately he was kind of burned and his bones were buried in this kind of crypt with this slab that seals over it. But you know, we see in the movie that if you shake the bones, it hurts the Scarecrow, but it only hurts him when these two, basically, because there's a sequence where a character is holding these box of bones and drops them and it's completely unaffected. Things like this. We also get things like this kind of book that says, oh, to kill the Scarecrow, you need to do this particular thing to completely kill it. Why wasn't that done when he was initially kind of buried? I mean, they've trapped the spirit of the Scarecrow, but they decided not to permanently defeat him. Instead, they just left the instructions about how to do that in this book. And it's like, well, why wouldn't you do that in the first place? Purely because the movie could happen, but, you know, it doesn't really make a lot of sense logically. We get a character, and he has this whole big thing about this really strong acid is going to melt this. It can melt through stone, and then it gets spilt on his hands. And then literally the next scene, this guy is kind of like climbing up like a like a cliff face with his hands that have just been burnt with this really strong acid and things like this. So there's kind of lots of kind of like little kind of inconsistencies. And I'll be honest with you, when I was watching this movie, I was kind of thinking about a score in my head. These kind of things added up and will affect my score, which I reveal in a minute. I think our main two protagonists aren't as interesting as some of the supporting characters. I think the supporting characters, to me, were the far more interesting, because you kind of wanted to know how much they kind of knew about it. There seems to be one, like the younger brother, who seems to be like the sheriff, doesn't really seem to know much about it, whilst the older ones kind of do and things like this. And I would have liked to have seen you know, more. And also, when were they planning, because this is like a family generational kind of curse, and like the younger generation, like our main female character, doesn't know anything about it. It's like, well, when were you going to tell her? Because I'm assuming that means she would have to know at some point. Things like this. So there's some undercooked ideas. Now again, this is a kind of a slasher movie, straight to video kind of slasher movie. Do we really expect, you know, very, very astute kind of writing here? Maybe it's a little bit too much to ask. You know, it's a schlocky B movie at the end of the day, but it is a fun one. I enjoyed this movie, and I was kind of toying with giving it a 7, but I think there's just too many inconsistencies really for me to kind of go that high. But it is an enjoyable film, so I'm going to set on a 6, which is an above average score. I mean, I gave the 1988 Scarecrow movie an 8 out of 10, so that to me is by far and away my favourite. But have you seen Night of the Scarecrow? If you haven't, does it sound good to you? Please do let me know, and I will look forward to seeing you next time. Bye for now.